Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by David Woods. David is an Indianapolis Star sports journalist who primarily covers the Butler Bulldogs. Given this is the 10-year anniversary of Butler's epic run to the national championship game, I chat with David about his process reporting on that team, the Bulldogs' various stars and players that allowed this team to be successful, their NCAA Tournament run, and of course, that epic national championship game against Duke with Gordon Hayward's half-court shot just missing. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. This is episode 43 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by David Woods. He is a longtime sports journalist with the Indianapolis Star, covering Butler. He's covered the Olympic Games. Longtime sports journalist. David, thanks so much for joining me today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Well, today I'm bringing you on because we are in the year that marks the 10-year anniversary of the Butler Bulldogs making their national championship run all the way back in 2010. We'll get into a lot of those moments, including the thrilling national championship game against the Duke Blue Devils. But I just wanted to start with you because, you know, people that know basketball know that Indiana is a hotbed for basketball in terms of talent and popularity. But if someone were to ask you to describe the culture of Butler when it comes to basketball, what would you tell them?
Well, they really do sort of live by that, so-called Butler way, which I know sounds very cliche-ish, and everyone has I think there's a Patriots way, and everyone has like their way, but it really has been a kind of a culture-based program, and it does give them an identity they can recruit to, and they've been able to preserve that through a lot of coaching changes. Now that term, or at least the components of the Butler way really were started when the current athletic director, Barry Collier, was a coach, and he went to a retreat with the had the former Wisconsin coach Dick Bennett, who had been in the Horizon League coaching at Wisconsin Green Bay, and coincidentally, the Jim Larinaga, the coach who took George Mason to a Final Four, was kind of at this same retreat. So that ended up being a pretty consequential meeting of the minds. And then Thad Matta is the coach who really probably coined the phrase, the Butler way. But basically it's kind of a team-first, defense-oriented approach. And they have, preserved that from Barry Collier to Thad Matta to Todd Licklider, and to Brad Stevens, to Brandon Miller, who was coached just 1 year, to Chris Holtman, and now to LaValle Jordan. And it does kind of give them an identity, which I think a lot of programs are kind of envious of, because if you mention kind of the Butler basketball brand, at least people in basketball really kind of know what that is, and that has been largely sustained.
And I'm just curious for you as a writer, covering this team. I mean, how many years have you spent covering the Bulldogs, and how has your reporting evolved of the team over the years? Because obviously, with a lot of different college programs, some years it's very good and the team does well, but then you also have to report on some years where they don't do so well. So I'm just curious, the challenge of keeping your content fresh and relevant in reporting on the Butler Bulldogs?
Well, I definitely got on a fast moving ship on my first year on the beat, because that was 2001, and I kind of arrived at mid-season, and that was Mata's one and only season. And coincidentally, it was LaValle Jordan's senior season as a player. And so that, seeing it from that standpoint was interesting. They won their league tournament, and then they defeated Wake Forest for Butler's first NCAA tournament win in 39 years. Not since Tony Hinkle was a coach, and they had won a tournament game in 1962. Had Butler won an NCAA tournament game, and that game probably still, which was the first NCAA tournament game Butler ever covered. That game probably still is the most bizarre Butler game I've ever covered, because Butler led Wake Forest at the half 43-10. It was just like mind-numbing. Wake Forest had been in the top 25 all year, and Butler made a bunch of threes, and Wake Forest couldn't score, and it was just bizarre. And then they the next year they should have gone to the NCAA tournament. They were 25-5 at the end of the season, but lost a first-round game to Green Bay in the it was then the Midwestern Collegiate Conference tournament, and they were snubbed. And everything then was about RPI, and if you're maybe too much into inside college basketball, the RPI at the time was like 71, which wasn't considered good. But people are probably familiar with the Ken Pomeroy computer rankings, and they started around that time. But their Ken Pom ranking that year was like 29th. So if things had been different, they probably would have got in the tournament. And I remember distinctly thinking when I saw the George Mason team, which played in the Final Four here in Indianapolis, and saw them, I would shake my head and say, well, these guys are more talented than 2002 Butler. But that's either here or there. But, they had a downturn, and then really were fortunate. They had two impactful transfers, Pete Campbell and Mike Green, kind of resurrected the program again. And then the Brad Stevens era started. And that was probably maybe next to the Wake Forest game, more amazing to me almost really than their Final Four run was they started the 08-09 season, which was the year before, unexpectedly started three freshmen and were picked to finish sixth in the league. And I thought it was very presumptuous to think that why would people think Butler's freshmen would be better than the other team's seniors? And also Butler had often kind of manipulated its schedule to kind of work its way toward had a strong enough schedule to get a at-large berth. Well, they didn't manipulate their schedule that way because they didn't think that was possible. Well, anyway, those three freshmen, Ronald Norrid, Gordon Hayward, Shelvin Mack, and company, they started the season 19-1, which was just like unfathomable to me, and ended up getting in the tournament, earning an at-large bid. They lost their first game to LSU, but of course came back the next year and won 5 games and lost to Duke in the national championship game in their home city.
Before we get into the 09-010 Butler season, Brad Stevens, of course, when he came into being the head coach, he was the second youngest college basketball head coach in the Division I basketball. And I'm just curious for you, David, in covering him, him being so young, what did he possess that just allowed the program and his players to succeed on the court?
Well, one thing that helped him is he took over a veteran team in 07-08. And that team, oddly, it's still probably my favorite team to cover. They were 30-4. I mean, basically, they almost never lost a game. So for a beat writer, that's kind of fun. You don't have to have any morose locker rooms and stuff like that to cover. But those older players, which I think I looked up, I don't know, their average age. I mean, they weren't that much younger than Stevens. Their average age was like 23, and there was an NBA starting lineup whose average age was younger than that Butler team. But those older guys all bought in, which I think really helped Stevens, establish credibility right away. But what I always say about Stevens, which I think makes him unusual, and I still think a case can be made that he's the best coach in all of basketball, is that he's very good on a relationship basis, with team building and not only telling each player on the team that he's important, but explaining that with some precision so that they really come to realize that they do have a role, and that the outcome of the team really does depend on them. And then also, tactically with analytics and so forth, he's also very good. Seems like most coaches, maybe like one or the other, they're good like motivators or team building, or they're really good with X's and O's. And I think Stevens is very good at both, which I think is unusual.
Let's get into the 09-10 Butler team. And of course, this was a Bulldogs team that preseason was ranked, 10th in the country, but they got off to a pretty mediocre start. And I'm just curious for you, as a writer covering the team, how do you write about a team that sort of underachieves to start the season? And what do you think enabled the team to turn it around to then go on and have the success that they did?
Yeah, they really did flounder along. They went to Anaheim, California in an early season tournament, and then they really got run out by Minnesota, and then they barely beat a very poor UCLA team, and then they lost to I think it was a top 25 Clemson team, but they really kind of gagged that game away. I mean, it was weird. I remember covering that game, and I don't know, you remember certain games, like the entire game, I was sure Butler was going to win, and then to like the last minute, I realized that they could lose, and they did. So that was kind of peculiar. And then they played at the Jimmy V Classic in the Madison Square Garden and got thumped by Georgetown, and that was and I found out later in the process of researching my book Underdogs and recapping the season that I think Brad Stevens had urged Ronald Norwood to address the team, and I guess Norwood went off on the team so loudly in the locker room afterward that Tom Crean, the Indiana coach, who I guess was in a nearby locker room, I could hear through the walls and thought it was one of the coaches yelling at them, but it wasn't. It was one of the players. So I think that was kind of a turning point. Although they also lost a subsequent game at UAB. So they were. I mean, they had some good wins too. They beat Ohio State. They beat Xavier, but they ended that portion 8-4. So it was sort of like, well, they hadn't been terrible because the schedule had been difficult, but they hadn't been that good either. So it was kind of hard to know, what to make of them at that point.
But this was a team, though, David, that had a lot of talent. When you think of sophomore at the time, Gordon Hayward, who goes on to the NBA, Sheldon Mack, a sophomore, Matt Howard. It just felt like to me that it was just going to be a matter of time before the team starts to round into shape. And going into the March Madness, they're a fifth seed. As much as they're very much have that underdog persona, they're still a fifth seed, which is still awfully good.
Well, yeah, heading into the NCAA tournament, they had won. Well, not only were they, I keep saying their league record was 18-0, which it was, but then they also won 2 lopsided league tournament games. I mean, they had won 20 straight games, all in the league. And really, my experience in covering Butler is they often played better and fared better against teams that were not used to their style, like power conference teams, then the teams in the league really knew them. And I remember I don't know, it was like the fourth or fifth game of the league season, but they went up to Detroit and led for much of the game. But a Detroit player made a basket. I think it was like 7 seconds to go or something like that to take the lead, and it looked like Butler was going to lose. And Hayward was fouled going to the basket late in the game, made one of 2 free throws to send it into overtime, and then they won the game in overtime. And I remember at that time thinking, boy, if they didn't lose this game, I don't know if they'll lose any. And they didn't, including one game at Loyola where they didn't score a field goal in the last 6.5 minutes, but won the game, I think, by a point. Loyola missed like a last-second tip-in. So they got some breaks along the way, too. And obviously some of those breaks continued into the NCAA tournament. But yeah, in hindsight, I mean, I'm not completely sure of this, but in hindsight, I think Butler might have had more NBA players, future NBA players on its roster, which was 2, than Duke did.
Yep.
Which I think maybe Singler might have been the only player on that team ever to play in the NBA. So they started 2 NBA players, Matt Howard, who was really kind of an iconic college player. Willie Beasley was a small forward who's still to this day, his 118 wins are the most in Butler history. And a point guard, Ronald Norred, who is a 2-time league defensive player of the year. I mean, and they had depth. So that's a really good 5. And then they had guys coming off the bench like Zach Hahn and Avery Jukes and Sean Van Zandt, who I think 2 years later was probably one of the 10 best players in the Horizon League. He wasn't voted that or anything, but I think he was probably one of the 10 best players. And I think Willie Beasley was probably one of the 10 best players in the Horizon League his senior season, 2010. So that, like, in looking at it now, and when I did a story going back to the 10-year anniversary and interviewed some of these guys, that was one of the things that Ronald Norred said, well, what people don't remember, what maybe not understood about that team, and it's what he said, we were good. If people forget, we were good. And I think that's fair and accurate, and you could have said that now, and with benefit of hindsight, you can sure say it again. That was a really good team. Now, they played really rugged defense. Some of the stuff that they did, I don't know if it would even be allowed in today's freedom of movement stuff. But on the other hand, it would have probably allowed guys like Hayward, to go to the goal and with more freedom and maybe get fouled even more. So maybe those things would even out. But Butler was very physical. Every time they ever played anybody, the opposing coach praised or complained about that. And there is a lot of, let them play mentality by the refs in the NCAA tournament, and Butler took advantage of that.
And then, as we get into the tournament, the first real scare for Butler came against Murray State, and they were a 13th seed. It was, a defensive battle. I remember rewatching it, Murray State was up at the half, and then, of course, Butler came back to win. Was that, an important test for Butler to be able to beat, a team like Murray State, which in my memory of watching the March Madness, it always seems like that perennial potential upset bracket busting team?
Yeah, that was a good team. Isaiah Cannon, I think he might have been a freshman at the time. He had the ball at the end that got stripped, and Butler was able to pull that one out. But yeah, that was a very difficult win for Butler. And I remember that game for a couple of reasons. Certainly the end, but also it was such a tough game. And then late in the game, Butler built a 6-point lead. And I thought, okay, they're set. They've got it. Well, I think Murray went on like a 7-0 run, maybe in less than 60 seconds to take the lead. I thought, oh, God, these guys are in trouble. But there had been so much preseason expectation with this team, partly because Hayward and Mack had been on the under-20 World Championship in New Zealand, where they were on the team that won the gold medal. Hayward was on the all-tournament team. So that kind of influenced some of the preseason rankings too. But I thought that was like sort of a burden off them. Okay, this team at least had made the Sweet 16. They had done that, and kind of like everything else would be a bonus. I don't think probably the team looked at it that way, but I just really had that strong sense that, okay, they've won 30 games. They've had a successful season. They've proved their point, and we'll see what happens next.
And of course, in the Sweet 16, they upset the number 1 seed, Syracuse Orange. Was that the moment, David, where you sort of believed that, okay, like this team could maybe go to the Final Four?
It actually was. In fact, I don't necessarily write some of these things that I think anyway, because you don't want to look like an idiot later. But there are several times that I, in my own mind, I've been prophetic. As soon as Butler, that game is over and they won, my thought was they will reach the championship game, and that did happen. Now they took 2 close wins over Kansas State and Michigan State, but that is a very vivid memory of mine. As soon as they beat Syracuse, I thought that they will be in the championship game in Indy.
So, the Final Four, of course, as you mentioned, is in Indianapolis and, very close to the Butler campus. For you as a writer, because the Final Four is one of the most popular sporting events on the calendar, there's a lot of media there. How do you sort of balance reporting objectively about the team, but also painting this picture of what an Indiana University making it to the Final Four in Indianapolis means for the school, the city, and the state of Indiana as a whole?
Yeah, the buzz in Indianapolis, during that week was amazing. I fell under a lot of stress because I have the team kind of to myself to cover all these years, and all of a sudden I'm covering the New York Yankees, where all these media outlets, including some from outside the United States, are covering the Butler story because it is so compelling. I mean, it's a lot like the Hoosiers movie you remember the scene at the end, and when he asks one of the kids, you want to say anything to the team, and he says, I want to, win this for all this other small schools that didn't have a chance. I mean, it almost gives you goosebumps because that is exactly what Butler was trying to do. It was, it's the smallest school to play for the national championship in decades. But it was, I did worry the whole week that I'd get scooped on some big thing about Butler. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but it worried me all week. And then probably as maybe the most amazing thing that I saw the whole week was the open practice, which I forget what day of the week that was. I think maybe Thursday, where you could see the teams practice, and almost the entire lower bowl of Lucas Oil Stadium was filled, and so there were nearly 40,000 people there to watch Butler's 50-minute practice. I mean, that was just astounding. I mean, I think even the guys on the team were kind of shocked to see that. So it was a huge deal, and it's really hard to overstate what a huge deal it was, because to a lot of people, I mean, even though Butler had starters from 4 different states, it was still kind of an Indiana story, and I think the whole state, which we really love basketball here, was just really just caught up in the whole thing. It was a lot like a fairy tale.
Yeah, and the Final Four takes place. Of course, Duke, really handles West Virginia quite easily. But then Butler had another one of their close games against Michigan State. Draymond Green was on that Michigan State team, who of course is now on the Golden State Warriors. But it just felt like to me, I mean, this jury leading up to Duke that, those close games, finding a way to win those really hard fought games served Butler well in preparation, preparation for the chance to play for a national championship.
Yeah, Butler trailed in the second half of all 6 games, which is just nuts. Trail in the second half for all 6 games. And, of course, everyone remembers that the Jim Nance call almost went in at the end when Hayward shot. Actually, according to, the ESPN's, scientist guy, if it had been like 3 inches one way, it could have carried him in. But the shot I remember was the baseline shot before that, where I think Zubek left his man and altered it just enough. But it was, I know sometimes the Butler teammates say, well, Gordon made that shot all the time, or blah, blah, blah. That was a hard shot. That would have been a hard shot. That would have been a hard shot to make from that position and so forth. But at one point, I did think it was going to go in, and just the whole thing was I don't know where that ranks, but for all the reasons that we've discussed, I think it has to go down as probably one of the 10, 12 most epic championship games in the history of the tournament because of all those reasons.
Well, absolutely. And I think, we'll dive a little bit more into that shot in just a bit, but I just think, setting up the championship game, you have Duke, which is, of course, a college basketball powerhouse against a small school like Butler. But we mentioned this before, David, but, Butler has future NBA talent on the floor, 2 players. It's not like Duke had a Zion Williamson or a Shane Battier. Kyle Singler, and this is no disrespect to Kyle Singler, but Kyle Singler was their best player. And I just felt like it was, the experience that, Coach K and the Duke program, gives here, which allowed them to have success. But you got to look at Butler and say, like, this is the best chance out of anyone to beat Duke. It's this Butler team with all this talent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and Brad Stevens has been pretty candid. He thinks if he had done a couple things different, or been a more experienced coach, he basically thinks that Butler should have won the game if he had coached it better. Well, that's an arguable point.
Of course.
Danny Ainge was up in the stands and watching that game, and I think maybe he thought otherwise. But that was a good team, and really, and in fairness to Hayward had like a good NCAA tournament, but not awesome. He wasn't. So yeah, that was a talented team. I'm not saying that, but like Hayward wasn't who he was going to become. I somewhat selfishly still wish he had come back for his junior season, because that team would have been incredibly good, and it would have been so much fun. Going around from city to city, it would have been like covering, I think, Jordan's Bulls or the Beatles or something. I mean, I think those guys would have been a big deal. But they, certainly were a talented team, and hey, won 25 games in a row, and then until losing to Duke. So, and then they were so much not sad at the end of the game as just an astonishment. I mean, they just always assumed they're going to win the game, and that actually is a big part of the I don't know, the culture, what they try to preserve. I mean, Butler, and then in the Horizon League, remember, they weren't a Big East program then.
No.
They just always thought that they could win the game. And the other thing I think you mentioned earlier what makes Stevens special. I mentioned the relationship building and the acumen with X's and O's. But he also, I think, inspires a lot of confidence in his players, to the point that no matter who was on the other bench, whether that was Tom Izzo or Mike Krzyzewski or you name it, in the Butler's players' minds, they always thought that they had the edge on the coaching staff, and sometimes that just becomes self-fulfilling. It's like a track and field coach training. If you think the training is good, then it is. But the guys were so confident, and I think that just kind of kind of spills over. If you're just sure that you have the edge in the coaching category, that's got to have a subtle effect on the team.
And then, as a writer, when you're in a moment like this, I'm sure very stressful because the game was very close, and of course you have Duke up 5 with about 3 minutes and 16 seconds left. Matt Howard gets 4 points to cut the deficit to 1. Look, if Brian Zubek makes both free throws, Gordon Hayward's shot would just get the game to overtime. He only makes 1 of 2, setting up, of course, a potential game-winning shot by Hayward, and then, of course, the dramatic miss. So, like, you as a writer, you sitting there, like, what's going through your mind? Because obviously, like, do you have 2 stories potentially to go with here? Were you watching to see what unfolds with Gordon Hayward? Like, what's the process in those final few seconds to encapsulate, as you say, one of the most dramatic moments in NCAA championship history?
Well, I remember writing just so I'd have enough. I think I wrote maybe 300 or 400 words ahead of time, just kind of going through their season and what had led to this point, so I could top it with what actually did happen. And I didn't quite write it this way, but I remember thinking, and I know that game is a very painful memory for so many Butler fans, and I'm probably in the minority. I still to this day feel like Butler proved its point without winning the game. There's also they're with an amazing collection of teams, because the next year too that like lost back-to-back. It's like teams that have lost back-to-back national championship games are like some of the most storied in the history of college basketball. But yeah, they just they couldn't. And a lot of people, including Izzo after the semifinals, I think he thought Duke could win by 12 or 15 points. And the game wasn't like that at all. And Krzyzewski was pretty candid afterwards, saying that we could not have overtime. We could not afford to have this game go into overtime because things were, with the crowd and the emotion and all that would not have been a good outcome for Duke. But you just, you do try to, keep your wits about you at the end and just kind of try to capture the moment, but I guess try not to override it either. I mean, really what the story kind of speaks for itself of what happened, and you just try to really tell probably as simply and easily as you could on deadline, because you don't have an enormous amount of time to think in the moment. But it was obviously epic, and it didn't require much literary knowledge to describe it as so.
And David, of course, many journalists I've had on the show have covered, championship teams, and that moment is surreal to be able to go in the locker room and experience that happiness. But I often find that some of the best pieces are from the losing team, and I'm just curious what that experience was like for you. Going into the locker room of Butler and just hearing the reaction, which I'm sure was pretty raw, given how close Gordon Hayward's shot went in from completely turning the table and Butler winning the championship.
Yeah, I that's a great question, and I was really disadvantaged from that because this is before everything was all about the I'm sorry, my phone ringing.
No worries.
In the background. I never made it to locker room because we had other reporters doing that.
Okay.
So I was doing just kind of deadline, get the nuts and bolts, set the scene, fire that one in. But it was kind of a the way the guys who in there described it was more a sense of disbelief than sadness. So they just thought they'd always won. They thought they'd win it, and and they almost did.
My final question, David, obviously, Butler, like you said, they made the championship game a year after. It felt a little bit more Cinderella-esque a year after than in 2010. But, when you look at 10 years later, and we talked about, Brad Stevens is coaching the Boston Celtics, Gordon Hayward, Sheldon Mackey in the NBA. What is the legacy that this Butler team, leaves behind that, allows us to still remember with fondness one of the real historical moments in college basketball?
That's a great question, because I think even now, 10 years later, I don't know that we really appreciate what a high mountain Butler climbed from where it had been. I mean, I wrote a book about the season afterward called Underdogs, and this was a program that in like the 1970s, I mean, not that long before Barry Collier arrived, there were private discussions wondering if Butler should even be Division I basketball. If they should just drop down and play with Wabash and DePaul and be non-scholarship or something like that. And that would be, that would have been just obviously none of this stuff would happen. But what I usually tell people is that no matter how amazing Butler's story is, it's more amazing than that. Just because of that. I mean, the field house was kind of in disrepair. They had for some of the period of years they had zero recruiting budget. I mean, zero. So, I mean, to sort of resurrect a program and to get to that level is really amazing. And we may see as we go. And we've even seen in the last 10 years how college basketball has changed, and there's, you can players from mid majors are transferring up to high majors and grad transfers. I mean, can a team from the Horizon League ever go to back-to-back national championships again in the next century? I'm with the way the sport is changing. I don't know if something like this will happen again. And we've had certainly some cool stories since then. I mean, Wichita State had some terrific teams, and that was cool when Loyola Chicago made the Final Four. But boy, back-to-back national championship games. And you're right, the second time, the 2011 team, that team wasn't even that good. but they got really hot late and made it back. And in all honesty, the odds of that were much greater than making it in 2010. But because Butler made it in 2010, we were sort of conditioned to think. And I remember after they, beat Pittsburgh in a wacky 2011 game, and you saw what the regional lineups were. I specifically remember a collection of journalists looking at the 4-team bracket when Butler were going to that regional in New Orleans, and the guys thinking, well, Butler could get out of that regional and go back to the Final Four. And that happened.
No, yeah. I mean, 2011, I just remember watching Butler, and it was wacky, and it was like why we love the March. It was why we love the March Madness, just because of, the fact that, these crazy things can happen. And I believe it was Butler VCU in that Final Four semifinal. And it was the highest two seeds combined to make, to be in the Final Four. And then I think
VCU was the play-in game. They had to win the play-in game to get into the bracket.
And then, of course, my condolences for all the journalists that had to suffer through that Butler UConn game.
Oh my God!
Because compared to the year before, it was one of the most boring games in the history of college basketball.
Yeah, it was amazing. And to think too, because Butler did everything right defensively. I mean, everything they did with their game plan defensively. I mean, they really, but you can't shoot 19%.
No, you can. But You know what, David? Next year, knock on wood, there is going to be college basketball in the March Madness, and it's going to be back in Indianapolis. So maybe good luck is abound for Butler or the Indiana universities.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how good this upcoming team will be, but they do they do have a culture, and they do have a legacy. Now that they don't have Gordon Hayward or Shelvin Mack on this team, but it's been a really rewarding program to cover, and just story. I really enjoy storytelling, and it's a fertile territory for that.
David Woods, he's a sports journalist at the Indianapolis Star, covers the Butler Bulldogs. If you want to read more about that great 2009-10 season, make sure to read Underdogs that David wrote. David, thank you so much for joining me today and reliving some really cool memories from that Butler team today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Been a real pleasure, Lucas. I always tell people there's the one subject I know of I could talk for 60 minutes about with no notice and no notes is Butler basketball. So thanks for giving me the chance to do that.
My pleasure.